So let's take what we've learned so far and actually put together and lay out an actual page in CSS. Let's have you open Layout and Layout End so you can see what we're going to accomplish. So let's take a look at this in our browser. I'm going to preview this in Firefox. And I see I have a structured page. So I have a header, I have a main content, I have a sidebar, I have a picture in the middle with the text that wraps around it, and I have a footer area at the very bottom. So let's make this happen. So if we take a look at our layout.html, I see that I have all those same elements as I scroll down my page, but nothing is structured at all. For this particular lesson, we're going to go ahead and do this in the designed view. At a later chapter, we'll actually look at doing this in the code view so that you know how to do both. I'm going to go ahead and click on Body and go up underneath my Insert menu, Layout Objects, and Div Tag. We've talked about this particular dialog box before. I can wrap it around the section, insert it before a tag, after a tag, etc. We're going to create our own ID here, and we're just going to call it wrapper. So now I have a container that I see by a dotted line selected around my page, and if I click on it, I see that I have a 0 margin, 0 border, 0 padding, because I haven't actually applied this to anything yet. I have this image up top for my header. I'm going to go ahead and select it, click beside of it, and I see that in my tag selector that there's an H1 involved in here as well. If I select that, that's actually wrapped around my image. I don't have any plans for that particularly right now, but there are a number of things that we could use for that particular tag with that image being inside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it. Insert, Layout Objects, Div Tag, and we're using IDs here. Again, it doesn't really matter whether I use a class style or an ID. So I'm going to call this header. And I'll click OK. And now I have a container around that particular section. Where my main content is here, all the way down before it says sidebar 1, I'm going to do the same thing with it. Layout Objects, Div Tag, and that is going to be our main content. Noticing as I scroll here that the image that I have in here, the text doesn't wrap around it. So I'm going to have to create something for that text to wrap around that. If I look in my property inspector, I see that I do have a name to my image. I have a border of 0, just in case I decide to put a link on it. And I have alignment of default. Notice if I click on top, the top line of my text goes just to the top of it. If I click on middle, it goes just to the middle, and bottom, it goes just to the bottom. Now, if I were to use left or right align, it's going to wrap around that object, in our case, our image. The problem with this is that we don't actually have a style applied to this. So I'm going to take that back to default. We'll scroll down a little further, and I see where my sidebar is at, and I will highlight that down here to my footer area. One more time, Insert, Layout Objects, Div Tag. This is going to be sidebar 1. Now we're going to use a float for this particular element, but it can be either left or right. So I don't have to worry about whether I have that in the name or not. It's going to go ahead and I can say at any point in time whether it's one way or the other. And one final one for my footer. Now we're not going to do absolutely every single bit of the work, but I do have a style sheet that we can use for this. So I'm going to click on my link, attach style sheet. I'm going to browse and I'm going to choose layout new. It is going to link and not import, and my media type is going to be screen, and I will click OK. So if I take a look at my file, I see that I already have some elements in here. Let me fold up my files panel. And I see that I already have my body tag, I have a paragraph tag, and I have some of my main elements in here that don't have any properties to them whatsoever. So either double click where it says wrapper, or I can click on the edit rule. So we're going to go ahead and make this a little smaller just because my resolution is fairly small on my page, and I'm just going to make it 760 pixels. So for instance, if I were targeting an 800 by 600 browser, then I would probably choose 760 as my width so that I can take all of the elements of the browser into consideration. I would also like this to be centered in the middle of my page. So I'm going to choose auto for left and for right. So it's going to auto on one side, auto on the other, and now it will be centered inside of my page. If I were to click apply, I should be able to see this at this point, and I can. So we'll give this a little bit of a border, and we'll just do same for all. I'm going to use solid, and I'm just going to type 1 pixel, and I'll just use a nice light gray. Feel free to use any color that you'd like. And I'm going to click OK. So what we've learned so far is now that I've said it is 760 and I've put a border on it, my container is no longer 760. It's now 762. So if I really wanted to make sure that it was 760, I would go ahead and take that value out of my 760 and type 758. And now it's back to being 760. There's really nothing all that exciting going on with my header at the moment. I'm going to leave that for now so that we can come back to that later if we need it. My main content, however, we are going to style. I want my main content to be on my left and my sidebar to be on my right. Because my main content comes before my sidebar in my structure of the page, we're going to go ahead and give this a float. So I'm going to click on my edit rule, and we're going to go to our box category. If this is going to have a float to it, I need to give an actual value to this. So I'm going to give a 500 pixel width, and I'm going to float left. I want to give this a little bit of margin left. So I will say 10 pixels. Now, I could also give this a padding as well, but we'll save that and see if we need it in just a little bit. So I will click OK. And I can see that my sidebar is now trying to move over to the right of it. We mentioned before that with floats, every other element underneath it, unless I clear that float, is going to try and move to the side of that particular element. So now I'll choose my sidebar 1. I will edit my rule, move my page so I can actually see it. Let's go ahead and give it a little bit of a background color, and I'll make it that lighter gray color. Now my elements go all the way to the edge here, so let's take a look at our box, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a 10 pixel padding as well. This is going to float. Now I can either float it left like my other container, or I can decide to float it right. I'm going to go ahead and float this right. Now this also needs to have a pixel width to it. So for instance, if I thought I might want a 200 pixel width, but I take a look and I've got a padding already. So let me take that out of my width, and I choose 180, and let's click apply. And I see that I have plenty of room here, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit of margin on the right hand side because I don't want it pushed right up against the edge of my container. So I will say right of 10 and apply. So I like that just fine. I will click OK. Now notice that my footer area is trying to sneak in between those other two because it doesn't have a clear to it at all. So if I scroll down, I can really see the mess that it's creating at the moment. That I have my main content area, it looks like it's escaping out of even my wrapper, strictly because I have a float on the inside, so it can go over top and expand around other things unless I clear that float. So let's do our footer first, and then we'll clear it. So I've got my footer. I will click on my edit or double click it in my CSS panel. Now we've also mentioned that my child elements inside of my parent element will take on the characteristics that we put on the parent. So for instance, if I wanted all of my text in my footer to be white, I'll move this out of the way just so I can see it. And if I were to click apply, I don't see my text any longer. So now let's go over to my block category, and I would also like that to be centered inside of my footer, which is going to look really weird at the moment. So I'm going to go click on center. And let's say that we give that a little bit of a background color, and I'll make it nice and dark, since our text is white. And back to box, and I'll give it just a little bit of padding on the inside. I don't want my text to sit right up against the rest of my elements. So I will click OK. And now I can really see what my float is trying to do. So it looks like my footer goes all the way up to the top of my content, but it really doesn't. If I take a look at my code with that highlighted, I'm going to make sure and click on footer here. I will click on code, and I see that it's really at the bottom of my code. So I'm going to click before the end of my div, and we're going to put our class style for clear float on a line break. And a line break is designated with a BR. So I've typed the first part of my tag. When I hit my space bar, my code hits pop up and let me see exactly what I can use for this particular area. We're going to use a class style, and we already have one designated as clear float, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. And all I need to do is hit my enter or return key after I choose something. Go ahead and put my cursor on the outside of my quote marks. So now I'm going to hit my /, and I will end that particular tag. I will refresh here, and when I go back to my design view and scroll down to the bottom of my page, you'll see that my footer is actually where I intend it to be. So what have I put on my clear float? I've just added a clear of both, and I've just given it a font size of 1 pixel so it doesn't really take up much space. Certainly not as much space as a regular line break would take. So now we're on to our image. So the image is the only thing we don't actually have declared over in our rules. We don't have a rule for that particular element. So I'm going to click on my new CSS rule. This is going to be a class style. I'm going to name it image float left. I will click OK. So simply, I'm going to float it to the left. Now we know already from looking at our other containers that if I float something, then everything beside it is going to try and wrap around it, which is exactly what we want with this image. And I will now choose my margin of 10 pixels on the right just so that the text doesn't flush with my image. I want a little bit of white space around it. Now I'll click OK. This already had the class applied to it, so when we made the class, it immediately wrapped the text around the side of it. Take a look at my property inspector, and you can see that I have a class style over here of image float left, and that was already assigned. But if this needed to be on the other side, then all I would need to do is make an image float right, apply that, and then my image would be over on the right-hand side of my page instead of the left-hand side of my page. That's the beauty of a class style. They can be applied at any point in time. I hope you've enjoyed working with page layouts, and feel free to further explore on your own.